Hello again, and welcome back to our series on spirituality and church architecture. Today we're going to be looking at Romanesque and its relationship to relics and to pilgrimages. We've now arrived at a point where the architecture of Christian churches throughout Europe becomes more or less standardized. Now, there are still local variations of art and architecture, but the Europe-wide need for new, large cathedrals constructed in the heart of centralized dioceses, and the need for churches that could accommodate large numbers of pilgrims tended to impose a certain plan on church architecture. Here is a map of the extent of Arab conquests in Europe, and as you can see, they made major inroads into the European heartland before they were pushed back by Charles Martel in France, and further to the east, not only by the first and succeeding crusades, but also by pressure from Turkic tribes to the east of them. The map you can see here is a result of those battles that pushed them back slightly. Now, in late antiquity, pilgrimage to the major Christian sites in the east, such as Jerusalem or Nazareth or Bethlehem, was fairly easy on well-protected Roman roads. But when those areas were conquered by the barbarians and then the Umayyads and the Abbasids, it became much more difficult. Now, it wasn't that the Arabs didn't want Christians to make pilgrimages, but they didn't exactly go out of their way to protect the pilgrimage routes either. And don't forget, although most of Europe is Christianized by this time, that doesn't mean that everybody was living in peace with one another. Crossing from the Holy Roman Empire into Burgundy or France or down into the southern states of Italy was still a risky business. So why did people make these pilgrimages to see holy places and holy relics? Why would they run that sort of danger? In the early Middle Ages, sight was viewed not just as a physical process, but also as a spiritual faculty. It was believed to allow individuals to perceive not only the physical world, but also the spiritual world, including God and the soul. This process is called extramission. Before the 13th century, most European and Christian thinkers, and others too, believed that vision worked through this process called extramission, where rays of light emitted from the eyes reached objects, allowing you to perceive them, to touch them through sight. This concept added a sort of spiritual dimension to viewing, to sight, because it suggested a direct connection between the eye and the world that we see. They weren't completely out of order here. You can see from that picture of a cat's eyes glowing in the night that it does seem as if rays are being emitted from the cat's eyes, this phenomenon of eye shine. The faculty of sight was also understood as a way to perceive spiritual truths and even God. And this was linked to the idea that the soul or the mind had its own form of sight that could apprehend higher realities beyond the physical world. It was a bridge to God. Medieval theologians often exploited the connection between physical and spiritual side, and they argued that seeing in the physical world would lead to understanding and appreciation of spiritual truths too. So holiness and evil were physical qualities that you could get by touch. Looking at an object could bring advantage to you, like touching it could. Very often these oaths of loyalty were sworn touching a holy object that gave a binding and holy force to the contract. Biblical passages, too, that described visions and revelations were often interpreted as evidence of a spiritual faculty of sight, and that further reinforced this idea of its importance in religious thought. Belief in second sight, the ability to see beyond the physical realm, also contributed to the spiritual significance of sight in the early Middle Ages, though this wasn't necessarily widely accepted. Now, pilgrimage wasn't just about the journey itself. You know that saying, it's better to travel hopefully than to arrive. Of course, the voyage itself could take on penitential features to it. There were frequent stopping places to see other relics, as we will see, as you were on your way to the main point of pilgrimage that your journey was about. But nowadays, we tend to see the journey itself as being a deep spiritual experience. That was true for them too, but in a slightly different way. It was a way of deriving deep spiritual benefit from actually seeing the relics and the places of pilgrimage themselves. It's an important point here. You needed to be able to see them physically to derive the benefit they were supposed to confer. Relics were believed to be the physical remains or the belongings of saints. And they were venerated as these conduits of divine power. They were thought to work miracles, really provide a tangible connection to the divine. Here you can see a Rhenish reliquary from about 1200 BC, that's AD, of course, made out of rock crystal, and that enabled the faithful to see the relic without removing it from its container. That removal was prohibited by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, since some of these relics were becoming damaged. And you can see on the right-hand side, the Romanesque reliquary dates from the early 8th century, and it's in the National Museum of Scotland. Pilgrimage was also seen as a form of penance and devotion. Travelling to holy sites was believed to cleanse you of sins, to bring healing, and offer in itself spiritual merit. You can see here some examples of what pilgrims were identified by at the time. They would very often carry a staff, they would have a special hat against the sun, carry a little flask and a pouch, and the pilgrim's wand or stick. You can see a pilgrim on the right is carrying perhaps a little bit of food in a bag that is flung over his shoulder. Maybe he's making a pilgrimage to become healed, since he also has a crutch. Sometimes you could take its healing powers home as well to somebody who couldn't make the journey themselves. His famous example of Simon Stylites. If you took clay from the bottom of the pillar of St. Hubert, for instance, you'd be able to cure somebody at home of migraines. Now, the difficulty of reaching the Holy Land resulted in churches like the Basilica of Santo Stefano in Bologna in Italy, and it was built in imitation of the 7 holy sites in Jerusalem. The majority of the complex that we see today dates from the 1100s, and it was a really important pilgrimage site for pregnant women who crawled into this sepulchre to kiss the relics of St. Petronius. You can see here that it's built in imitation of the holy sites in Jerusalem itself, including a Pilate's courtyard, the Church of the Martyrium. There's even a little pillar which has the cockerel that crowed when Peter denied Christ, or a stone imitation of it anyway. These pilgrimage routes, especially to Santiago de Compostela, inspired the design of these larger Romanesque pilgrimage churches that you can find on the way. We'll be looking at a small number of those, and we'll see that there's a standard pattern to many of these churches for very important reasons. Now, the important features of these pilgrimage churches were intended to make them practical for purpose as well as beautiful. And you can see here some of those features, these ambulatories on the right-hand side. You can see them here in blue, and the radiating chapels in this pinky color on the outside enable pilgrims to walk by and view or even touch the relics in each chapel without disturbing the services at the high altar that took place here in the apse of the church. So the pilgrim would enter here, would walk up the side aisle, around the transept maybe, and then round here and begin to venerate the relics in these radiating chapels, and then leave by the other door without even having to walk through the main nave or interrupt what was going on in the apse itself. These pilgrimages also oops, here we go. Conform to a cruciform plan that you can see here. And that was symbolic as well as functional. They were guided on their spiritual journey, the culmination of it sometimes in some of these churches. And as I've said, they would enter through this north door, walk the side aisle, visit the radiating chapels, walk down the opposite side aisle, and leave by the south door. All the while they were tracing with their whole bodies in this walk the form of a cross. Here are some famous cruciform pilgrimage churches, and as you can see, they come in rather a standardized design. These vaulted ceilings and these thick walls accommodated much larger crowds, so that the churches feel really solid and permanent. But they also convey this impression of divine strength and transcendence at the same time. This is the main aisle of Saint-Sernin in Toulouse, in the southwest of France. There were important economic and social effects to these pilgrimages. They fostered cultural exchange too. Towns along pilgrimage routes, like those on the Way of St. James, flourished economically because of the influx of vast numbers of pilgrims. They fostered this cultural exchange, a spread of artistic styles, including Romanesque sculpture, manuscript illumination, and monasteries and churches that housed these relics became wealthy and very powerful, able to fund more and more elaborate building projects and art commissions too. Here you can see some of the little souvenirs that pilgrims would take home with them. They ranged in price, as they do today, from the cheap stamped out little iron souvenirs that you could stitch on your cloak, to ones made out of more elaborate materials like gold, even gold that had been in close proximity with the blood of St. Thomas of Becket, the martyr of Canterbury. On the bottom right, you can see a very beautiful reliquary casket of St. Thomas the martyr. Very often these little souvenirs, we might call them, it's a bit of a frivolous name to describe their spiritual power, had been touched to the reliquary itself, the main reliquary, or even spent a day or two in there, and they'd been blessed by the bishop or the priest of the church, so they carried that spiritual power with them that people took home. After seeing the relic, they could take with them something that had been in close proximity to it and came from that very place where they'd made the pilgrimage. Now, these reliquaries also became more and more elaborate thanks to increasing skills that were developing at the time. Here you can see on the right-hand side this beautiful Bursa reliquary from northern Italy. It's in the Cloisters Museum in New York City. And these church sculptures and decorations that were becoming standardized depicted the scenes from the lives of the saints, often the very saints whose relics were housed in those very churches. This is a very good example of an ancient relic below here. It was probably a reliquary. It was probably made in the 8th or 9th century, but it was beautified further in the Romanesque and Gothic periods. It was thought to belong to St. Patrick, in fact. When it was opened, it was found to contain several leaves, ancient leaves of the Gospels. And on the right-hand side, a very beautiful cross reliquary, which is French and dates from about 1118. These pilgrim routes that you can see here were spread the Romanesque style throughout different areas. It created this sort of shared visual and spiritual culture of Christendom. And we've seen then that both pilgrimage and relics were really deeply intertwined with Romanesque spirituality, and they shaped the physical, cultural, economic landscape of medieval Europe. Now, prior to the year 1000, many European Christians believed that the second coming of Christ was imminent. The end was nigh. And when the apocalypse failed to happen in 1000, scholars declared that it must be on its way in 1033, 1,000 years after Christ's death and resurrection. So from about 950 AD onwards, there was a huge increase in building activity in Europe, especially of religious structures. And part of this was due to the millennial expectations of the time. This speculation about the end of the world in 1000 or 1033. And these pilgrimages might have been inspired by a sense of thanks that doomsday had been postponed to ensure salvation whenever the end arrived. So it better make the most of it right now. Here you can see the entrance portal of a pilgrimage Romanesque church, the Cathedral of Saint-Lazare in Autun in France. This tympanum, the space over the entrance door, we know the name of the sculptor of this, Gilbertus, and it's a scene of the Last Judgment. And remember, these are on the west side of the church, so they would be lit up by the setting sun, as if it was the end of the day, the end of the world. And here we see the last trumpet on the bottom right-hand side, and we can see St. Michael weighing the souls there in a scale, with the wicked on the right and the good on the left. St. Foy, Sainte-Foy in Conques, has one of the most famous west doors of the Romanesque pilgrimage churches. Its westwork is a little bit of a departure from the severe Carolingian style, and it's the first church to have a rose window. Can you see the small rose window up at the top there, dedicated to the Virgin Mary? Now, these tympanums had several functions. Obviously, the Last Judgment was central to medieval Christian belief, and the depiction of the Last Judgment over the entrance of the church symbolically reminded the worshippers that they were entering sacred space to prepare themselves through an awareness that damnation or salvation was in store for them based on their faith, based on their actions. Here you can see the portal of St. Foy. We have Jesus in a mandala there with these wonderful clouds surrounding him and stars. His right hand is raised in blessing and his left hand is lowered, pointing to the damned. We can see both groups here in this picture. The Last Judgment is this real powerful visual summary of the story of heaven, of hell, sin, redemption. And these carvings were intended to inspire awe, fear, reflection. And as you entered the church, you were put in mind of repentance and the importance of righteous living. They're a real visual reinforcement then of the idea of the church as a gateway to salvation. You had to walk underneath these tympanums to enter into the church. Also, in the Romanesque period, churches were often used as venues for legal proceedings, including trials and oaths and the administration of justice of one sort or another. And having images like these in front of you when you swore an oath or arbitrated a dispute, it must have really reinforced the seriousness or the truthfulness and the terrible consequences that awaited you if you gave false testimony. Now, it's not all grim. This is also Saint Foy in Conques. It has a series of these whimsical faces that are peering over the ribbon moulding around the arch, underneath which you can see the images that we just saw of the Last Judgment. I don't know if they're peering on in joy, in horror, in anticipation, in expectation. It's an interesting feature of this church. It's also a period in which the doctrine of purgatory started to develop more fully. And by the 1100s, the idea of purgatory as a state of purification after death and a physical place where that purification happened was widely accepted in the Western Church. But the idea of purgatory, it's very difficult to find it in the Bible, but it was formalized into Christian doctrine at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274. It's rare to find big depictions of the purgatory in Romanesque art, but here you can see a depiction of it in what's called the Calden Doom painting in St. Peter and St. Paul's Church in Calden in the United Kingdom. It dates from about 1200 AD. Now, carving wasn't just restricted to these exterior portals. The story continued when you entered into the churches. The capitals of the columns depicted these key moments in the story, so that as people walked down the aisles there, they weren't just thinking about what they were going to see. They were looking at the images and pictures and stories and carvings of the whole of the Christian story, carved in stone. These are from Autun in France. We have these beautiful depictions of God questioning Cain about his brother Abel, a very famous picture of the Magi tucked up under a blanket with a star over their heads, being warned by an angel not to return to Herod. We have an interesting one of the flight into Egypt and the death of Judas on the bottom right there. Now, because of the incarnation then, physical objects become the means of grace. We know that because we use wine, bread, water, and it's not a big jump really to imagine that the remains of a particular holy person could do the same. The relics, as we've seen, mediate grace. These people were people who were beloved by God, and praying through them, praying with them, meant that God perhaps would be more likely to listen. And some pilgrimage shrines of relics had special powers of their own. We've already seen how the burial sites of martyrs, particularly holy Christians, became the sites of churches. And if a burial site wasn't really in a convenient place, it was outside the city, it was in a cemetery, the relics would be moved under the altar of a newly built church. And the relics became to be enshrined in very valuable containers of gold and silver and gems, enamel and ivory. And they were often portable too, so that they could be used in procession. There's a famous example of this. This is the reliquary that you can still find in the church of Saint-Foy that we were looking at earlier on. It's a good example of furta sacra, which means holy theft. Relics were sometimes stolen by the monks or the clergy, who really believed sincerely, more or less perhaps, that a saint wanted to be moved to a better location, a more spiritually vibrant location. Now, Saint Foy was a martyr of the early 4th century under Diocletian, and she was initially buried in Agen. But around 866, a group of monks from the Abbey of Conques, not a very significant place at the time, they didn't disguise themselves, they became members of the abbey in Agen with the explicit purpose of stealing the relics. They were there for 10 years. They avoided suspicion. They got access to the place where this particular relic was kept, and they stole it and took it down to Conques. You see, in medieval thought, a saint's relics had agency, as we've already seen. They could express dissatisfaction. They could perform miracles. They could convey a wish to be moved to a more fitting resting place. They interceded on behalf of the people who came to visit them, to see them, to touch them with their eyes. This is the shrine of Saint Léonard de Noblat in Haute-Vienne in France. People would make pilgrimages to special places dedicated to a particularly useful saint for them. A patron saint of childbirth, as we've seen, a patron saint of lost things, patron saint of the blind, of commerce, etc. Criminals could take the pilgrimage as an act of penitence. And of course, it was also a way of seeing the world. Here in this church of Saint Léonard, pilgrims often made intercession for the liberation of prisoners. Here, this is due to the story that King Clovis gave him the right to release prisoners whom he deemed worthy of mercy. And the stories from that period say that when the intercession worked, the chains miraculously fell off these prisoners in response to St. Leonard's intercession. Of course, these grand pilgrimage routes, given the fact also that some sick people took this path in order to be healed. This is on Pons, on the pilgrimage route to Santiago, and it's known for its interesting Romanesque facade there that you can see on the left, beautiful door, and its little pilgrims' hospital that still stands and that you can visit today. Now, these churches are obviously much too large for the local population. They received hundreds and hundreds of pilgrims every year who came to altars and the shrines in these churches to pray to a piece of the true cross, say, to the bone of a martyr or the tomb of a king. Here we can see the most famous of them, perhaps, Santiago de Compostela. And once again, you can see this strong pilgrimage church design here. The relics of St. James are placed beneath the high altar of the church. And on the bottom right-hand side, you can see the beautiful Romanesque configuration of its interior. People still make pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela today. We see a classic picture of a pilgrim with his staff and his little conch, cockle shell, and his hat and bag. The bags and the hats are a little different today, as are the pilgrim staffs, perhaps. Here's just a couple more examples. Here's Tours Cathedral. I've put this example here to enable us to recognize more or less easily the ground plan of a Romanesque church. We've already seen some of its chief characteristics as a pilgrimage church, but here you can see these heavy dark blue and black lines show the heaviness of the walls in a Romanesque church. And here you can see Saint-Sernin, Toulouse, the cathedral there in France. The ground plan, once again, with these heavy walls. You can see how it was structured in this elevation on the right, with the side aisles where people would process and leave. And here you can see its westwork, which was interrupted several times over. You can see it's sort of like a trifle. It's got various levels to it, a Romanesque level and a level with this strange crypto-Gothic arch over the top of a very bold rose window that they were experimenting with at the time. They thought everything would collapse if they punched a round hole in it, so they had a heavy wall to support it. Here you can see its enormous size and how many pilgrims it was intended to accommodate. And here is a picture of its beautiful north transept of Saint-Sernin in Toulouse. That's all I have for you on Romanesque pilgrims and relics. Next time, we're going to be looking briefly at regional forms of Romanesque architecture. Until then, thank you for joining us. And I hope to post another of these very soon. Bye-bye for now.